What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life. We talk about guns, tactics, use of force, and today ammunition, the right way with God Almighty at the center. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. With Judeo-Christian values and real-world first-hand experience. All the things that I've been blessed to do as a professional gunfighter in my adult life are gifts from God. He blessed me with those experiences and blessed me to live through those experiences. There's plenty of times where I have felt the cold sting of death or the imminence of death and was delivered from that by the hand of God. And I'm very grateful for that. With that, I'm going to put in a very short version of the bio, and then we'll get into today's topic on ammunition storage, different types of ammunition, and ammo extravaganza. Bio. First and foremost, I am a Christian. That is number one in my life, serving God, following Jesus. Combat veteran, served in the United States Marine Corps and the Army. Also law enforcement veteran, private contractor, state rifle and pistol champion. Professional big game hunter and guide. If you feel called to support, check out Patreon. There should be a link in the show notes. With that, I am your host, Michael Melito, and I am blessed to serve you today. Okay, ammunition. It's such a broad topic. Let us talk about common types for the modern gunfighter, as this is gunfighter life. I love old esoteric stuff as well. I like black powder. I even like archery. But let's keep it in the modern context for the modern gunfighter and what you're likely to find online at your big box store that are legit options, again, for today's modern gunfighter, modern defensive shooter, competition shooter. I guess I'm going to start with steel versus brass. Brass is better. Brass is better in almost every conceivable way. Steel is a cost-cutting measure. And there are people that I respect that differ from this opinion, and I think that's okay that we hold different opinions, but I'm of the opinion that stuff is close to garbage. If you have a high point and you want to buy a case of steel ammo to run through it, have at it. But if you have a decent firearm that you're going to use for defensive use, I am kind of against running steel ammo through it. And again, there are people that I respect that don't hold that opinion. Here's why I hold that opinion. It is hard on your guns. It's hard on extractors. On many extractors, many modern extractors, not all, but many, like a Glock or like a AR-15, they can and do break. Especially something like an AR-15 where that extractor is being shoved forward over the rim of the cartridge. Steel is harder than brass. I don't think I have to really go into depth about that. But it's harder on that extractor as well, and that is one of the main failure points of an AR. And you don't really know when it's going to give out, usually. So, if you want to buy a dirt cheap AR and go to a training class and run a couple of thousand rounds through it at the training class, and then when you get back, replace your extractor and replace your barrel, then, okay, I've seen the legit math where you can do that and buy a new barrel and buy a new extractor and still come out on top because the steel-cased ammo is that much cheaper. There are a certain number of thousands of rounds. Okay, but let me ask you this. Are you actually doing that? Are you actually doing that? And after you run those thousands of rounds, before you use it for defensive use, if you're going to use the same gun, are you replacing that extractor, replacing that barrel? Because you don't know if that extractor is going to give out on the next round or the 1,000 rounds from now. And again, steel case is harder on that kind of stuff. If it's for competition, then, have at it. If you rip an extractor and you blow a stage and you just go home and you had a bad day, no big deal. If it's for some kind of defensive use, gunfighting, home defense, Why run the steel case through it? Also, most steel ammunition, not all, but there are some exceptions, but most, don't just have a steel case, they have what's called a bimetal jacket. And a lot of times they'll wash it with copper, which is just like a film, very, very thin on the outside of the copper. I've looked into it in depth before. But if you take a magnet to that projectile, it'll stick. And not because there's some steel core in the center of it, but because the actual jacket is iron or steel, some kind of mild steel or iron. The jacket is steel. So you're shoving at very high velocity, at very high pressure, a steel jacket through a steel barrel. And you can say, oh yeah, it's softer steel. Okay, is that what you want to be doing? Do you want to be shoving a steel jacket through a steel barrel? Again, steel is much harder than brass and copper. They use it because it's cheaper, not because it is better. I'm not a fan of steel-cased ammo. I'm certainly not a fan of bimetal ammo. The one exception to that would probably be an AK-47. They are made to run steel case. They just are, right? That's kind of how they were designed. They have a much beefier extraction system, in my opinion. They were kind of designed for that. The ARs and many of our modern guns were not designed for that. So I wouldn't recommend it for that. If you want to have steel case in like a giant spam can for when the zombie chipmunks descend upon us, and you figure at that point it's the last of your ammo, and if your guns get destroyed, it is what it is because that'll be the end, then okay. But in general, I'm against steel ammo for most things. There are some notable exceptions, but just why? You're going to spend all this money on a nice gun and literally tear it apart and wear it out prematurely because the ammo was a few dollars a box cheaper. That math doesn't make sense to me. If you want to do it, it's your life, it's your guns, it's your money. Have fun with it, but I am generally against steel-cased ammo and especially bimetal ammo. Brass is better. Now let's discuss full metal jacket versus modern defensive ammunition. Usually, and there are some exceptions to this, but usually defensive ammo, you're talking a hollow point for a handgun, and you're probably talking some kind of soft point, maybe a hollow point for a rifle. And let's get into that real quick. You don't necessarily want a hollow point for a rifle. In general, you want a hollow point for a handgun, but in a rifle, you may want something else, like a soft point, because rifles are going at way higher velocity. A lot of times, three times the speed of a handgun. And these are rough numbers. These are not a specific load out of a reloading manual or off of a website, but this is how I like to remember things in these generalities. In general, 9mm will come in your heavier for caliber 147s, your super light for caliber, most common 115 grain. You're talking just under or just over the speed of sound, which is roughly, and it depends on elevation and temperature and all kinds of stuff, humidity, but roughly the speed of sound, let's call it 1,000 feet a second for rough numbers. And your 9mm is going to be just under or just over that. A lot of your common rifle rounds, like 5.56, let's say a 55 grain, is going to be 3,000 feet a second, so roughly 3 times. And not always. You're talking, you go with a heavier round, you might be around 2,800, but it is much, much faster. So you're talking different things. You're talking different mechanical engineering, different mechanical physics. Just like, not to get too off in the weeds, but you take the exact same round, like a 357 Magnum, and you load it in a handgun, the exact same load out of the exact same box, and you put it in a rifle, even in that same caliber, you're going to get vastly different ballistics. And a hollow point round that will perform very well out of a, like say a 4-inch service revolver, will perform very poorly out of that rifle. Even though it's more powerful, it's getting more velocity because you're realizing more of that potential energy because more of that powder is burning. But because it's designed for a handgun, it may expand too quickly and give you not enough penetration, because that's a balancing act with expanding ammunition. Penetration versus expansion, and they have an inverse relationship. because when the frontal diameter of that round, that bullet, increases in diameter, it decreases its ability to penetrate. And I hope I didn't get too nerdy on that, but I think it's important. So just because hollow points are good for a handgun, and they're generally the go-to, they're not necessarily always the go-to for a rifle. A lot of times soft points are your go-to, or a ballistic tip, which is, I think, trademarked by Nosler, but a polymer tip, some kind of synthetic material tip. And that does a couple of things. It basically acts like an older lead soft point. Not that they don't make new lead soft points, but it's an older technology. But it can help the shearing off or deforming of the front of the bullet in a modern semi-automatic. You'll sometimes see these in handguns, like Hornady's really big on these, and that's because it puts some kind of media pre-staged in the hollow point. So it's still a hollow point, but they'll put the polymer in there so that it won't get clogged with something else that won't let it expand with the right density, like denim or windshield glass. So that's kind of the polymer tip. It basically stops the front of the round from deforming on feeding. It can also improve ballistics coefficient, and it can also stop the front of that round from clogging with something you don't want it clogged with. So that's ballistic tip in a nutshell. Focusing more on the handgun, full metal jacket, generally, and that's just a term. A lot of them aren't even full metal jacket. A lot of them have an exposed lead base, so technically they're not full metal jacket, but they're going to be referred to commonly as ball rounds. They're generally your most affordable, and you generally use these for practice. You should still run some of your actual defensive rounds through your gun, and I've talked about this principle before, but I absolutely think you should make sure that you pair your practice ammo with your defensive ammo to make sure that they shoot same point of aim, point of impact. I would look for one with a similar grain weight, similar velocity, similar bullet profile to make sure they fly the same way through the air and impact the target the same way. It doesn't do you a lot of good to do a bunch of training with 115 grain and then load up 147 grain when they shoot in drastically different places. Right? Match those up and do whatever you want. Right? Match a 115 grain target round with a 115 grain hollow point. I'm not endorsed by any ammo companies, but Speer is good for this. They make the Lawman, which is their practice round that has, again, similar ballistics to their defensive round. So you could get 115 grain Speer Lawman and 115 grain Speer Gold Dot. You could get 147 grain Speer Lawman and 147 grain Speer Gold Dot. You get the idea there. And these a lot of times have the benefit of having the same feed geometry and profile, because not all handguns will feed all hollow points. Well, not all handguns will feed all ammo, period. But some bullet profiles don't feed well in certain guns. And I've had Glocks, and Glocks are known for eating everything and being super reliable. But I've had some modern defensive ammo that was good ammo and a Glock that was a good Glock, but it just didn't like that pairing. It just didn't work well. You have to test your rounds, your bullet profile, and everything out of your gun. Now, talking about the hollow points, and I've done whole episodes on just defensive ammo, so I'll briefly do a flyover here. But your traditional is going to be kind of your standard hollow point. You can add features from here. It's basically going to be your brass cased jacketed lead round, but instead of the jacket going all the way over the top, full metal jacket, it's not. It stops. There's a lead core to that bullet, and there's a hollow point or a hollow cavity that lets some sort of media, if it's defensive use, it's designed for flesh, to get in there, and at the velocity it's traveling at, it should, in theory, open up to do more disruption and to do less collateral damage to innocent people. Because something like a 9mm or a 45 is not super powerful compared to a rifle, but they will still, in general, penetrate a lot more than the average human torso. So you want your round to expand, one, to dump all its energy in that target so it doesn't dump its energy in another unintended target. Also, to increase the frontal diameter so it can disrupt more tissue and increase its effectiveness. So it's kind of a twofold thing there. And that's your basic design. It has an exposed lead with a hollow cavity, dish, bowl, however you want to picture that. When something, a lot of times hydraulic pressure, because flesh, our bodies are mostly water, when something like that gets in there, it forces that lead open and splits that jacket open if everything works properly. And you can build onto that. You can bond either mechanically or chemically that jacket to the lead core so it doesn't separate, because that's fairly common. You can, as we aforementioned, put in some kind of polymer elastomer tip on the top of that round. It doesn't get clogged with denim or sheet metal or whatever and stop it from expanding. You can add things like low flash powder so it's not making a giant fireball at night. You can do things like nickel-plated cases that are a little bit slipperier, at least in theory, than your standard brass case. There's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot of engineering and physical mechanics that go into hollow point ammunition. It's its own kind of science. And I've done whole episodes on like my favorite 9mm loads. If you want to dive deeper into that, you can go nerd out with me on those episodes. There's also a couple of other options, and I'm not talking about crazy whiz-bang off the charts, like this is the next best defensive ammo, it's a game changer, quote unquote. Right? If you're using a round for defense, you want a round that's proven with street cred. You don't want the next experimental cool thing that might be a game changer, right? You want a proven defensive round. There are some that have been around a while now that are proven. I call these kind of a screwdriver round. There's a bunch of different designs that are slightly different, but they all kind of look like a Phillips head screwdriver. And these are kind of designed to disrupt tissue in a different way. They're designed to kind of use those grooves that are cut into the bullet to push the media, if you're talking about defensive use, flesh out to the sides. They also may or may not tumble, but these have been around long enough and have not gone away. They're not just a flash in the pan, kind of like a Glazer safety slug or something. They seem to be legit, and so I want to discuss them briefly. And I don't think that I would choose one over a hollow point in traditional calibers and traditional rolls like a 9mm or a 45, but they may have some application, like a 380, where you're right at that threshold where there's been a lot of advancements in the 380 in the last several years, but when you get that low in power, again, you have to balance that penetration versus expansion. And if you're starting out with less power, that's harder to do, because if you start increasing that diameter, you're decreasing the penetration potential. You might go too far, especially with like a 380. I would consider like the borderline bottom for most defensive uses. Something like that, you may want to look at one of these screwdriver rounds. Whether it's, Lehigh Defense, or I think Ruger even made some for a while. They may still make their version, which is kind of strange because it's like a pressed metal and polymer. But these rounds exist. They seem to work. A lot of times, these rounds will be solid brass. They'll be like CNC machined from solid brass. And solid brass rounds have their own advantages. They do tend to penetrate pretty well. And going back to that, you can also have a solid copper round. Like it's just copper. There's no lead core. It's just copper. You can have those, and those have come a long way. And they're really good for hunting in a lot of places. They're not just for, hippies that hunt in California that are mandated to use them. They're pretty good for hunting rounds and rifles. But they're also some decent choices for solid copper hollow points. They're generally going to be lighter for caliber because copper is lighter than lead. But there are some really good options. In fact, one of my go-to 357 Magnum loads, I'll sometimes pocket carry a 357 Magnum, is one of these solid coppers. Solid copper, again, is not just for where it's mandated as far as legislation goes, but in certain circumstances, it can be a really good option. They tend to hold their integrity very well. We talked earlier about, mechanical and chemical bonding of jackets versus the core. Well, you don't have to worry about that separation if it's all one piece, right? There is no jacket, there is no core. It's all one solid piece. They'll sometimes call these monolithic bullets. They're all one solid copper thing. So you're less concerned about core jacket separation because there is none. And again, they tend to penetrate fairly well. Even though they're kind of light for caliber, they kind of play by different rules than the old traditional cup and core bullets. It's one of the reasons they're really good for hunting, or can be really good depending on your situation for hunting. Now, let's talk about rifles. Let's transition for a little bit. Hollow points. When you think hollow points for handgun, you think hollow points for defense. With a rifle, not so much. Don't think that because a rifle round is quote-unquote a hollow point that it's a good defensive option. A lot of hollow point rounds, like your Burgers and things like that, are phenomenal bullets, but they're really good for target practice. They're really good for high BC. They're really good for punching paper or steel at distance. They're really good for match ammunition. But the fact that they're hollow points, they're not hollow points really designed to expand. They're hollow points designed for really good ballistics coefficient. And while they technically do have a hollow point, not designed in the same way for the same parameters and for the same terminal performance that pistol hollow points are. So don't assume that just because a box of rifle ammo says hollow point that, oh, it's a defensive round. Not necessarily. Now, all these rounds could kill. Like your poorest option, your Full Metal Jacket 25 ACP has killed people. It certainly can, but it's not a good choice. Just because a rifle ammunition of a given caliber says hollow point does not mean it was designed for defense. So don't think that. Just because it says hollow point doesn't mean it's designed for defense, doesn't mean that it's designed for hunting. In fact, many of them, hollow point rounds, are designed for target shooting and high ballistics coefficient. But there are very good rifle rounds and common calibers that are hollow point rounds. Do a little bit deeper dive if this is going to be your home defense round or your truck gun round or whatever, your hunting round. Do a little bit deeper dive than, oh, it says hollow point on the box, so it must be a fantastic defensive hunting option. Not necessarily. There are some very good hollow point defensive rounds. But just because, again, it's a rifle round that says hollow point does not mean it was designed for defensive use at all. Kind of your traditional in this, guys, is not a hollow point at all. It's a soft point round. It's a traditional cup and core, meaning a lead core with a copper jacket, with an exposed lead tip. And those work great. And that's going to be your classic like Remington Core Lock, Federal Power Shock, things like that. Things that are common, 308, 30-06 caliber that have been putting deer in the dirt for decades. That's kind of your classic. And again, you can build off of that. You can put a polymer tip on there, or nozzler, if you're nozzler, a ballistic tip. That will increase ballistics coefficient, may not get mangled feeding in and out of the magazine. Has a couple of advantages there. Basically, on impact, it'll usually shear off and become a soft point round. So you can build off of that. You can go, again, with bonding, and just like your handguns, you can go mechanical or chemical bonding of the jacket to the core. The, Remington Core Lock denotes that it's a locked system. If that's what you want, if you want your bullet to hold its integrity. And normally for defense and for hunting medium to large game, you do. But if you're talking about a varmint cartridge, you want your cartridge to lose all its integrity. If I'm shooting a prairie dog with a 223, which is a lot of fun, and I thoroughly enjoy, something like a 36 grain varmint grenade, where it's basically, as I understand it, a jacket with powdered metallurgy, like powdered or sintered metal inside that jacket. And these are devastating. I used to hand load these. But shooting a prairie dog, and it'll dump a massive amount of energy in a very short amount of time. A varmint round. Because you have, going back to velocities with a very light round like that, it is going well over 3,000 feet a second in a 20-inch barrel 223. And you're hitting a target that's maybe 2 inches from front to back, and you want it to dump as much energy as possible. You want that round to fly apart very rapidly when it hits the target. Varmint bullets are kind of their own thing. And you may think that you don't want a lot of penetration because you're using this for home defense or something. Let me touch this briefly and not go down a giant rabbit hole. But any round that is reliably going to put down a human being is going to over-penetrate, let's say, drywall, your average home construction. It just is, period. Let me say that again. Any round that will reliably stop a human being will go through most modern home construction. Worry about problem number 1 first, stopping the threat and hitting your target. Worry about the other problems later. You can do things to kind of mitigate that. Again, hollow points for handgun are better than, for a lot of reasons, are better than full metal jacket. Let me put it to you this way. I don't know who you are, I don't know how big you are, but I don't think I can punch a hole. I don't think I can just grab my fist and punch a hole through your chest. Right? But I can go to pretty much any drywall and punch a hole in it. Easily. Human beings are tougher than normal home construction. Anything that's going to reliably put down a person is going to penetrate, or has the potential to penetrate. It may not. It may tumble or fall apart or something. But in general, I think that's a way overplayed thing. I would not recommend you use varmint bullets, or I would not recommend you use birdshot for a defensive use because of overpenetration. Worry about problem number 1 first. Stopping your target by hitting your target well. Now, recently, a lot of the rifle world has gone to long-range precision type shooting. A couple of terms get thrown around a lot. I'll briefly explain those here. Ballistics coefficient, BC. It's got to have a high BC, man, or you're not cool. Ballistics coefficient, the ability of a bullet's construction and profile to cut through the air, to move through the air. The bullet that will move through the air more efficiently has a higher ballistics coefficient. It's the ability of the bullet to fly through the air. Think about the shape of a 45 ACP, 230 grain full metal jacket, and something like a 5.56 green tip. If you pull both the bullets out of the entire cartridge and look at the bullets, you can just look and think about that in your head and those flying through the air and which one is going to slice through the air better. The 223 green tip. And green tip's not the most high BC bullet, but it's certainly high BC compared to a 45 ACP, just to bring it to the extreme so you can picture it. They'll do things like make these bullets long for caliber if you want a higher BC. Right? Your traditional 308 bullet will be 150 grain. Your high BC bullet for 308 will be 168 grain. At the low end, maybe 175 grain and up, because you're making it long for caliber. Also will help with bucking wind and things like that, which is really important. They'll also do things like putting a boat tail on the back of the bullet to make it a little bit more streamlined. Put a long, sleek ogive on the bullet, which just the front of the bullet is very long and sleek. Going back to like Burger's kind of known for this. They have long, sleek, very pointy, very long bullets for caliber in general for the high ballistics coefficient, and they do that very well. Sectional density is a term that's kind of related, but not necessarily a one-for-one. But that's basically a bullet's ability to penetrate thicker media, like its intended target, sectional density. Okay, that was a lot, and I thought that was going to be a very short intro to the episode. I want to talk about other things on this episode, like ammo storage. Ammunition can last a very long time. There are still, people that can go out and shoot World War II ammunition. Couple of things that really will kill ammunition is massive temperature fluctuation and moisture, whether straight up like water or humidity. Those are your two common things. You're probably not dealing with acid and salt and things like that. Your two most common things that are going to hurt your ammo are massive swings in temperature, especially heat, and water humidity. If you mitigate those two things, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Storing it in a cool, dry place. Ammo cans are called ammo cans for a reason. They basically keep out moisture. If you're looking at long-term storage of ammunition, I would recommend the ammo can. That's what it was designed for. And I would just take a hand warmer and I would shake it up and throw it in there. If you don't know, a hand warmer is basically a giant oxygen absorber. That's how it works. It heats up by absorbing oxygen, which will absorb the oxygen out of that container. You can buy like a desiccant and stuff, but the hand warmers tend to be cheaper and they work very well. So if you want something like that, you can throw it in your ammo can. If it's for just long-term storage, just the metal military surplus ammo cans. Now, I prefer the plastic ammo cans if it's for something I'm using all the time for training. They tend to tear up the floor a little bit less, the upholstery in a vehicle a little bit less. So just like a plastic ammo can, if I'm using it to carry some ammo, let's say I'm going out to the range and I want some 9mm, some 223, and some 12 gauge. I'll throw some of that in the plastic ammo can. A couple of my other range things that I maybe don't want to put in my range bag, I'll throw that in a plastic ammo can. But we're talking short-term storage usually. And there are other ways. There are especially other ways that militaries have stored stuff. So you're looking for, again, that kind of long-term storage, grid down, apocalyptic type stuff. And I don't make any apologies for being a survivalist, for being a prepper. The militaries have thought about this, obviously, and they store their ammo sometimes for long periods of time. In America, we used ammo cans, but not always, and not all countries do that. They're what's called like a spam can. They kind of look like a giant sardine can or a spam can. It's just basically a can like you would get food in, but much larger, a little bit beefier made, and they put the ammo inside that. Some of them even have like an old key that you would turn, like an old, food can, if you're old enough for have seen those. But that's a real good way, assuming you don't have so much rust and moisture that it gets all the way through the can, that you can keep that ammunition dry. So you may just want to buy some ammo like that. Let's say you're going to have one or two Mosin Nagants around for arming other people. Hopefully that's not your primary gun, but you have a couple around just in case, and you want to buy a spam can of that old 7.62x54R. You can do that. Also, if you're getting into ammo that's quite a bit older, beware of corrosive ammo. That has its own problems. You need to thoroughly research that and clean your guns if it's corrosive ammo, but most modern ammunition is not. Some of the stuff for this type of application may be. Also, something that you'll see that I like a little bit better than that, or this the heavy-duty rubber plastic sleeves. Sometimes you'll see this in like pistol calibers, 380, 9mm. Some other countries did it with their rifle ammo. You might find 308 or 5.56 in it, and it's basically like a rubber sleeve, sometimes with a handle on it, which is really nice. Varying amounts of ammo in there, per the caliber, per the country. Those are really nice for long-term storage. Again, assuming the outer container has kept its integrity and hasn't let any moisture in, you're good to go in that. As long as you don't put it in some crazy hot or cold environment, it's good to go in that. Maybe buy a couple, buy one and train with it, make sure it works in your gun. If you want some long-term storage ammo to keep training, if we go through another crazy ammo shortage, which if you have been gunfighting for any amount of time, you've lived through one or two ammo shortages. So it's not like some crazy conspiracy theory tinfoil hat thing. Like there are ammo shortages all the time. Maybe you want to buy a couple of those sleeves of, the NATO water-sealed and whatever container, 9mm. After a couple of years, there's no ammo shortage. You buy a couple more, you shoot your older ones, and you always have a back stock of ammunition. Also, I don't think with inflation that ammunition is going to get any cheaper anytime soon. So if you buy it now in store, it's kind of like giving yourself a raise in the future because you'll be getting more ammo for the same amount of money. You buy ammo now that you shoot in 2 years. 9mm has gone from roughly let's just go back. There was a time when it was $9, $10, $11 a box not that long ago. Now it's closer to $20 a box. If you had bought a couple of cases when it was $9 to $11 a box, you'd have a lot more ammo to shoot for that amount of money now. Likewise, if you buy some now, if it goes to $40 a box, I hope that doesn't happen, but I wouldn't be surprised, then you're going to be able to have a lot more ammo for the amount of money that you spent versus the $40 a box 9mm ammo. And there's nothing wrong with your normal everyday ammo that you're going to shoot and train with, just putting it in a cool dry place, right, in your, wherever that is, right, in your pantry and wherever is cool and dry for you. In a separate closet that's somewhere that doesn't have like water pipes running through it or something like that. Just a cool dry place. Nothing wrong with storing your ammo that way. And it's original, let's say you buy, the Winchester white box. You just keep it in its 50, 100 round box until you shoot it. If you plan on shooting it in the next several years, it'll be fine. As long as some crazy thing doesn't happen like a house fire or a flood or something like that, right? If it's ammo you plan to shoot fairly recently, I wouldn't even worry too much about it. Now let's talk about defensive ammo rotation, because if you're talking about a carry gun, whether it's a truck gun and a long gun or your daily carry gun, you're probably not keeping it in a cool dry place. By very definition, If it's a concealed carry gun, it's concealed on you, which means it's probably a hot, moist environment, the opposite of what ammunition likes to stay stable and long term. Now, most modern ammunition, especially defensive ammunition, I'm looking at right now, my gun that I have sitting here on the table that was my EDC earlier today and probably will be when I get done recording this podcast. Right now it's right in front of me on the desk, but I picked up my spare mag and I'm looking at 147 grain Winchester Ranger T, and I'm looking at the primer, and not only is the back of the primer staked in so that it can't back out, one of the added benefits of defensive ammunition, but it is also got some kind of sealant lacquer in the back of the primer to stop moisture from getting in. Those are all good things. But even so, you should have a regiment for rotating out your carry ammo. Every 6 months to a year is pretty standard throughout the industry for law enforcement, for federal agencies, things like that. Rotating out your ammo. So if it's been a long time since you've rotated out your carry ammo, maybe go to the range and shoot that and replace it with some new carry ammo. Also, there's a thing called round setback that you should be aware of. If you administratively load and unload, if you're dry firing, 6 days a week, every day except for Sabbath, because on Sabbath you shall rest. Right, but if you're dry firing every day, you're probably loading and unloading that gun. You should make it a point to rotate, and let's say the round you took out of your gun, mark it and put it at the bottom of your magazine or in your spare magazine, not loading and unloading the same round every time. If you do this, you can get what's called a round setback, where the round gets set back into the casing. This can, without getting too nerdy into physics, this can greatly increase the pressure. I shouldn't have to tell you why that's bad. So you want to mitigate that, and that's another reason why you want to change out your carry ammo. I recently just did this again, and it had been about a year probably since the last time I had rotated out my carry ammunition. It's a good thing to do. If it's your carry gun or your truck gun, this is a gun that you're thinking you may have to defend your life with. You may have to protect your life or somebody else's life with this gun. The bullet needs to be able to do its job. It needs to go off properly. It needs to do all the things that it's designed to do. If you are carrying a firearm and ammunition to defend your life or somebody else's life, that is a weighty matter. It's important to get a practice ammunition and a carry ammunition that perform the same. It is important to rotate out your carry ammunition. If your carry ammunition is green and has round setback and stuff, really examine that, right? If you are carrying a round in your gun, like you go out and you practice with 115 grain ball and you're carrying 124 grain plus P, whatever, it could be a very good round, and you've never tested it through your carry gun to make sure it shoots point of aim, point of impact, as laws of physics dictate it probably won't if it's a different velocity, different grain weight, different bullet profile. And it may or may not feed through your gun. Again, I've had Glocks, really good Glocks that I really liked, with really good modern defensive ammunition, but that gun just didn't like that particular bullet profile. It didn't work well with that gun. You have to test that stuff out. You can't just assume because it's got a fancy packaging or because it's a gun that's known for being reliable that it actually is going to be with that ammunition. This is gunfighter life. This is not drooling over recoil magazine life. This is not, and there's nothing wrong with recoil magazine, it's a good magazine, but that's not going to make you a good gunfighter. It's not buying the next cool EDC widget on Amazon. It's not having a really cool packaging on your ammo. That's not what really matters. What really matters is training and testing your equipment and being good and proficient with it. And I guess that's a good place to end this episode of Gunfighter Life. If you enjoyed this episode, if you thought the content was valuable, you got anything out of it that you thought was worth something, consider becoming a patron. I recently added a $1 tier. I'm considering getting rid of it, but it's $1. Even if I get rid of it, if you're in there for $1, you'll still be in there. But $1, what is that compared to a box of ammo? If you like the show, if you're a regular listener, consider supporting the show. Consider putting your money where your time is instead of just on cool widgets on Amazon that you might forget about in 6 months. Actually think about supporting this show and the content to make godly men strong and strong men godly, to make good men well armed, well equipped. If that's something you want to support, consider becoming a patron. There should be a Patreon link in the show notes. Tactical tip of the day. I've got two for you. This is the time of year when a lot of people are out and about, hopefully in the woods, hopefully outside, enjoying God's creation. Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows us His handiwork. Hopefully you're out there getting some nature, enjoying some of God's creation. Doing a lot of packing, a lot of stuff like that. You may be open carrying. You may be doing stuff like that, hiking. One of the things that you may want to consider doing on your magazine or magazines, depending on how many you carry, for your EDC or whatever, you may consider putting a bright colored piece of tape or sticker on your magazine. Then doing stuff like that, your magazine may fall out. Different than an urban suburban environment where you're trying to conceal it and somebody may see if you have like a bright orange sticker. It may increase the odds they're going to see your gun or your magazine, but that's less of a concern if you're out open carrying or even concealed carrying out in the woods. People shouldn't be that close to you to see a small sticker on a base plate. If the magazine release gets hit, your magazine falls out, or your spare mag falls out, and you have to go back and look for it, makes it a lot easier to find. And you probably have some bright, obnoxious colored sticker or tape hanging around anyway. If you're like me, you use them often for dry fire targets and such. Putting one of those on a base plate of a magazine can really be nice. Also, we talked about hollow point ammunition. If you're talking about defense against animals, you may be looking at different bullet parameters. I'm not telling you what you should carry for your given situation, but we talked about that hollow points being a balance between penetration and expansion. You may want different parameters for, let's say, a bear than you do for a person. Maybe you don't, but it's at least something to consider. Consider that you don't always want hollow points. Sometimes you may want like a old classic truncated cone semi-wad cutter. Want to go super old school, you may decide for your situation just a hard cast lead bullet is better. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. You should examine that for yourself. But just because hollow points are the best day to day for urban suburban carry doesn't mean they're necessarily the best choice for you in the backcountry, in the woods, doing things like that. Anyway, those are your tactical tips for the day. Your tactical verse of the day. This is one I was meditating on this morning. Speak to the children of Israel. Tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a blue thread in the tassel of the corners. And you shall have the tassel, that you may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord and do them, that you may not follow the harlotry to which your own heart and your own eyes are inclined. And that you may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy for your God. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God. We should live a life remembering God and what He wants us to do, and not following the harlotry to which our own hearts and our own eyes are inclined. Is that how you define your life? Are you living your life based on what God wants you to do, or based on just whatever you feel like doing? Those are very different lives. One is right and one is wrong. You can basically boil sin down, well, I like to boil sin down, into thinking about it that way. Sin is saying, God, I know what you want me to do, but I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. And you say, don't eat that fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but it looks really good and I want to do it, so I'm going to do it anyway. I know you say, don't commit adultery, but that woman looks really good, so I'm going to do what I want to do anyway, even though you tell me that I shouldn't. And even though we know deep down that God designed us, He knows what's best for us, but we're going to do what we want to do anyway. It's ridiculous on its face, yet we still are inclined to do it. It would be like buying a brand new Mercedes-Benz and saying, I know that the manual and the mechanics and the engineers, they all say to put gas in the tank, but I'm going to put sugar in the tank because I like sugar and I think I know better than the people that designed this thing. When God designed you, He gives you instructions for your good, for my good. He tells us how to live our lives. A God that loves us so much He created us to begin with. And He tells us what's best for us, how we should live. And it's sin when we say, I know what you say, but I'm going to do what I want to do anyway. So be less focused on what you want to do and focus on what God is calling you to do. Not so much on the harlotry to which your own eyes and your own heart are inclined. And focus on God. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.